Okay, this lecture is about seagrass, saltmarsh, and mangrove ecosystems. So seagrass, saltmarsh, and mangrove ecosystems have something in common, and that's that they're all biogenic structure. Biogenic structure means structure made by living things. So bio for living, and genic made by, and structure means structure. Let's see if I can get the pen. All right, so they're physical features of the environment formed of living things or by living things. So in the picture here, we see multiple kinds of biogenic structure. These vertical sticks are the prop roots of red mangroves, so that's creating some biogenic structure. And that biogenic structure is being settled on by other organisms, these lettuce corals and these sponges here. So as these organisms settle on the existing biogenic structure, they're creating even more biogenic structure and creating quite a structurally diverse environment. So we consider in this situation that the mangroves are the primary biogenic structure because they're the underlying living structure here, and that the sessile invertebrates like the corals and algae and sponges on the roots are secondary biogenic structure adding on top of the primary biogenic structure. So in the marine environment there are many different kinds of organisms that create biogenic structure from many different phyla of life, even different kingdoms of life, even different domains of life. So in the domain bacteria, there are microorganisms that create bacterial mats that are very simple prokaryotic organisms, but en masse they can create these biogenic structures, even hard biogenic structures like stromatolites, which will be discussed in the reef lecture. Then there are multicellular organisms that create biogenic structure as well. Multicellular plant-like organisms that create biogenic structure are called macrophytes. Macro means big and phytes means plants or plant-like organisms. So multicellular plants and seaweed would be considered macrophytes. And I've divided the macrophytes up into intertidal macrophytes that live in the area that's only some of the underwater some of the time. So that includes mangle habitat, which has mangrove trees in it, saltmarsh habitat, which has herbaceous vegetation in it, and rocky shore seaweed habitats that are exposed at low tide. Below the waterline in the subtidal zone, there are additional types of macrophyte habitats like seaweed beds, such as the kelp bed in the picture on the right here. This is a kelp bed. And also seagrass beds, which are made by true plants called seagrass that we'll discuss later in the lecture. And there are many types of biogenic structure that are made by animals. So hard rocky material biogenic structure made by animals, those are called reefs. So reefs can be made of corals, of bivalves like these oysters, of tube worms that have calcium carbonate shells, and there's actually quite a variety of organisms that can create reefs in addition to the classic coral reefs. Then there are emergent sessile and sedentary benthos on loose sediment bottoms. These would be sort of stalked organisms like hydroids, bryozoans, even some bivalves like pen shells that have shells that protrude, that stick out of the sediment. Some tube worms that have decorated worm tubes that stick out of the sediment. And then on hard bottom habitats like rocky bottoms, there's a huge variety of what we'll call fouling communities that have sponges and often soft-bodied organisms that stick to and sort of build structure on top of whatever hard bottom there is. And in addition to the organisms that create a structure with their shells or skeletons, there are organisms that sort of sculpt the environment into structure. And those can create burrows, furrows, and mounds of sediment. And even though the organism's bodies themselves may not be a structural component, their habitations and excavations become structure in the environment. So these are some visual examples of biogenic structure. A is a coral reef. B is an oyster reef. It's not a very dense oyster reef, looks like just some scattered clumps of oysters on a mud flat, but that is some biogenic structure. And perhaps from the same mud flat in picture C, this is a Diapetra worm tube, so it's a type of sedentary worm that builds and decorates a tube and creates structure. In D is a seagrass bed, so you can see these subtidal plants that are forming a meadow underwater. E is a mangrove forest, an intertidal forest that lives in salty waters. And F is a sabellarid worm and mussel reef. So this honeycomb looking material here is a network of worm tubes made of sand and calcium carbonate, and these dark bivalves here are mussels, and together they're sort of making these clumps of biogenic structure that create the reef. So biogenic structure has many values for ecosystems, and I'll sort of explain some of the benefits provided by biogenic structure one at a time. So one of the first things that biogenic structure does is it increases the surface area of the benthic environment. So in this picture on the left here you see a benthic environment with no structure, and you can, if you sort of tallied up the surface area, there's a moderate amount of surface area, perhaps room for this many blue circle organisms to establish. But if you have biogenic structure in the environment, there's much more surface area and much more territory for organisms that live attached to a surface to attach. So the surface of the seafloor, or the surface of any solid object in the water, can be considered to be sort of a reactor surface for microbial processes. Many microbes are not planktonic drifting in the water, but they're attached to a surface, and so a lot of microbially mediated processes happen at the interface between the solid surface and the water. So if you're increasing the surface area of solid surface, you're increasing the amount of microbial community that's in contact with the water and carrying out various ecosystem processes, such as primary productivity, if these little organisms are algal cells, for example, water filtration, nutrient cycling. The little organisms that attach to a solid surface in the ocean do all kinds of important things for the ecosystem, and therefore the more surface area you have for them to establish, the sort of more efficient the ecosystem is at carrying out these ecosystem processes. Another really obvious value of biogenic structure in the marine environment is that it provides a lot of hiding places for organisms. As you can see in this little conceptual diagram here, some of these green fish are sheltering under whatever this is here, coral. The pink fish are sheltering in another part of it. So in sheltering in biogenic structure, you can be more protected from predators, and there are some species that specialize in hiding in cracks and crevices in biogenic structure, and we call those cryptic species, meaning they're sort of camouflaged or hard to see, and they really do well in habitats with a lot of biogenic structure. Also, in an environment where there's biogenic structure, there's different microenvironments. So in a featureless habitat, the environment is all the same, but where there's structure, you can sort of differentiate between the caves and crevices underneath the corals versus the branches above the corals versus the area above pelagic waters above the corals, and you've sort of got three different microenvironments that might be suited to three different species, and this variety of microenvironments can facilitate higher species diversity. The other thing that structure does is it modifies hydrodynamics. It modifies the way water moves through the environment. So some structures might reduce water currents, other structures might accelerate water currents or create more water turbulence, and that can benefit or harm organisms in different ways. So one of the most important things about structure is the idea that structure can enhance biodiversity. Biodiversity is the number of different species or the variety of life in the environment. So there's various ways that structure enhances the types of life in the environments. And one way we just mentioned is that with structure you introduce more types of microenvironment, and that means you've got more opportunities for specialized species, each species occupying a different microenvironment in the structural habitat. When you add more species, there's kind of a positive feedback where more species begets more species. We saw that in that first image of the mangrove roots providing a habitat for the corals and sponges, which in turn might provide a habitat for other organisms. So as you add structure and add diversity, it compounds on itself. Another way that it compounds is because each species in the environment has its own predators, its own symbiotic organisms, its own parasites, and so when you're adding a little bit of diversity, you oftentimes end up adding a lot of diversity. And then this is bullet point here is describing the secondary structure concept, the idea that with some structure, then other organisms will settle on top of that, and you'll end up with these really complex biogenic structures made from multiple species of organisms piled together. And then this concept that I want to introduce on the next couple slides is the idea of niche differentiation and niche space. So structure adds more dimensions for niche differentiation, and that basically means structure adds more ways that organisms can specialize and creates a greater possibility for species to play different roles in the environment. Famous ecologist from the mid-20th century, Hutchinson, had a model of niche differentiation that he called an n-dimensional hypervolume, which sounds really complicated, but I'm going to try to explain that in the next couple slides. All right, so before we get into the n-dimensional hypervolume, let's start with a simple one-dimensional model of niche space. So niche space is sort of the range of environmental conditions in which a species can survive. And in this case, we're describing the species niche space simply in terms of temperature. This temperature range from 20 to 30 is the range in which this particular species of fish can survive. This wouldn't have to be temperature, it could be any ecological factor. But if you only have one dimension in your niche space model, you can only consider one ecological factor at a time. You can add multiple species to this niche space because this range of temperature is occupied by this species, but this other species is specialized in living in cooler temperatures, and it might live in deeper waters or waters at higher latitude or upwelling areas where it's cooler. If you add an additional dimension to niche space, you can come up with sort of a more complete model of what set of environmental conditions are needed for the survival of that organism, because obviously temperature is not the only thing that matters to a fish or another organism in the environment. There are other factors that have to be within the right range for that species to survive, and we can add those to our conceptual model, making it a two-dimensional model now, which has an x-axis and a y-axis. Y-axis, x-axis. And so now we're sort of using this two-dimensional square to describe the potential range of habitable conditions for this species. And as we add more dimensions to our model, we see that there's more room to kind of stack different species in there. With each new dimension, there's sort of more ways that you can divide up the range of conditions in the environment, with each species having sort of a unique set of conditions that it occupies without overlapping with the range of conditions that the other species occupy. In 3 dimensions, niche space would become sort of a cube or some sort of other 3-dimensional shape. I just threw in pH as a potential environmental factor that we could add in, but it could be any arbitrary factor. Anything that might vary in the environment is something that you could add there. It could be, light levels or nutrient levels. Lots of other possibilities exist. And beyond 3 dimensions, humans, at least myself, we can't visualize more than 3 dimensions, but mathematically we could add an unlimited number of dimensions to our niche concept model, and an arbitrary unlimited number is what the n means. So n just means like however many dimensions you want to add to your model, to describe different environmental conditions that could vary within some range. That's n dimensions. So, adding biogenic structure to the environment adds new dimensions to niche space. So in addition to kind of, 3 dimensions that we added there, these are sort of different ways that organisms could sort of divide up the environment if there was a structure in the environment. So if there's a structure in the environment, you could live on the structure, above the structure, under the structure, and that's more ways of living than you would have if there wasn't a structure. If there are different types of structure in the environment, then some organisms might live in one type of structure, others in another type of structure. And so if you have a diversity of different types of structure in the environment, you can have a greater diversity of species. And that's just a few of the many possible examples. All right, so let's talk about a particular set of organisms that create biogenic structure, and those are the macrophytes, the multicellular plant-like organisms. So I'm showing 4 pictures here. We've got a seagrass bed, a mangrove swamp, a salt marsh, and a kelp bed. And 3 of these are sort of form a natural set, and one of them is a little bit different. Which one do you think that is? Well, I think the kelp bed is the one that doesn't quite fit here because the other 3 habitats are all made by true plants, plants with roots, leaves, stems, flowers, whereas the kelp bed is made by macroalgae, which are on a very separate branch of the evolutionary tree. So I would say that the mangroves, salt marsh, and seagrass are a set, and the kelp beds are different, although there are other ways that you could classify them. I mean, maybe you would say that the mangroves and the salt marsh are similar because they're both intertidal, and maybe the seagrass and the kelp beds are similar because they're both subtidal, but I like the evolutionary classification. I think that's the natural grouping of these 3. So these 3, mangroves, salt marsh, and seagrass, I'm calling the trifecta of marine angiosperms. Angiosperms is a term for flowering plants because all of these organisms are true flowering plants. Their flowers don't actually look like this rose, but I just picked a familiar flowering plant to represent that these are angiosperms, like a rose. So there's a couple things to help you keep these different things straight. Mangroves live only in tropical and warm subtropical habitats, whereas salt marsh is found mostly in temperate and cold habitats, although you can have salt marsh in tropical habitats as well. You would not have mangroves in cold habitats, and that's probably why salt marshes are more prevalent in cold habitats where they're not excluded by mangroves. Salt marshes and mangroves are both intertidal, meaning that neither of them is underwater all the time, although they do have their roots in salt water. And seagrass, they're the ones that are fully submerged, so they live their whole life underwater. There are some places of the world where at extreme low tides the seagrasses will be briefly exposed, but for the most part they're underwater and they don't have adaptations to deal with drying out. Seagrasses are interesting though because there are some species of seagrass that live in tropical environments and some that live in temperate environments, so they're really found all over the world, unlike mangroves, which are only found in the tropics. Alright, so we're going to focus on seagrass beds first. Seagrass is my research specialty, so I have a great love for seagrass. And seagrasses are any true plants that live their entire lives submerged in salt water. So we'll say in another slide or so what a true plant is, but more about what a true plant is. But the basics are true plants have roots, which you can see in this cutaway drawing here. Veins, so they have veins that carry water and nutrients back and forth between the roots and the blades. They have flowers, and you don't see that on my simple drawing here, but Flowers appear on seagrasses at various times as they reproduce sexually. Um, they have seeds and they have pollen associated with their sort of sexual reproduction system. And algae don't have any of these specialized features. So there's some things that people will call seagrasses that are not actually seagrasses. So seagrasses, remember, they live their full lives submerged under the water. So if you're seeing some plant that looks grass-like, but it's growing out of the dry sand, or it's growing intertidally with the shoots sticking up out of the water, it's not a seagrass. Also, seagrass is one word. So this is a saltmarsh grass here. Saltmarsh grass, this is not seagrass, and this is dune grass, not seagrass. And seagrass is very different from seaweed, even though the words are confusingly similar. So seaweed is another word for macroalgae. And so macroalgae is not a true plant. It doesn't have roots or veins or flowers or anything like that. So here's a couple of important differences between seagrass and seaweed. So there are not that many species of seagrass in the world. There's only about 60 species of seagrass in the world, and they're all green, since they're all true plants which evolved from green algae millions of years ago. Whereas the seaweeds, there are many, many different species, thousands of species, and many different colors from browns to reds to greens. And seaweeds don't have roots, or at least not true roots. There are some seaweeds that have root-like structures to help them attach in sandy bottoms, but most seaweeds need to have some kind of solid rock to attach to, or rock or shell or other hard surface, whereas the seagrasses have true roots that go down in the sediment, and seagrasses kind of have an advantage in sandy or muddy habitats where it's hard for most species of algae to stay attached. Seagrasses do have some weaknesses, though. They need a lot of light, very clear and shallow water, whereas seaweeds, of course, they need light as well because they're photosynthetic organisms, but they don't need as much light. They can get by on less light. Seagrasses, because they're able to get nutrients from the sediments with their roots, and because they grow slowly and need a lot of light, they actually prefer low nutrient environments. In a high nutrient environment, macroalgae and microalgae as well have an advantage. They grow very fast and they block out the light and smother the seagrasses. So in an environment that's getting polluted with an excess amount of nutrients, you tend to have displacement of seagrasses by algae, which grow over and smother the seagrasses. All right, so let's review the evolution of plants and see where the seaweeds and seagrasses and other plants fit on the evolutionary tree. So to do this, we're going to go way back in time, almost to the very origins of life on Earth, which was somewhere between 3.5 and 4 billion years ago. So relatively soon, perhaps only a couple 100 million years after the first primitive chemosynthetic organisms evolved, some of those organisms evolved primitive forms of photosynthesis. But those early forms of photosynthesis that evolved 3.5 billion years ago or so didn't create oxygen. It was other types of photosynthesis that were less efficient than the type of photosynthesis that evolved about 2.5 billion years ago and created oxygen as a byproduct. This time period, 2.5 billion years ago, was actually kind of a crisis for the Earth because there was a big change in the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere due to the explosion in abundance of these oxygenic photosynthetic organisms, which were related to cyanobacteria. But life did adapt to the newly oxygen-rich environment and eventually survived and continued to evolve. Another billion years or so later, the first eukaryotic algae were present. So eukaryotic algae evolved in an interesting way where some cells engulfed photosynthetic algal cells, and the cells that engulfed the photosynthetic algal cells were heterotrophs, until they sort of took on the photosynthetic algal cells as symbiotes inside them, and eventually over millions of years the organisms sort of fused, and the remains of the photosynthetic algae that were engulfed are now the chloroplasts inside the eukaryotic algae. That's the endosymbiotic theory of the evolution of eukaryotic algae. And that actually happened multiple times, which complicates the family tree of the eukaryotic algae, because there are many sort of unrelated types of heterotrophic microbes that became photosynthetic via endosymbiosis of eukaryotic algal symbionts. Anyway, some of those eukaryotic algae developed multicellular body structures and became the macroalgae, the seaweeds. We don't know exactly when that happened, but it was by at least 600 million years ago, because we have fossil evidence of multicellular seaweeds by then. Some of the green seaweeds, a particular group of seaweeds, by about 475 million years ago, they began to adapt to living on land and became the first primitive land plants. So at first, land plants were not very tolerant of drying out, and they were real primitive forms similar to the mosses that we have today that could only live near the edge of the water. But gradually land plants developed ways to tolerate drying out, to reproduce in air environment without needing water for their gametes to travel in, and land plants sort of exploded and colonized the entire land. One of the big innovations that happened on land was the evolution of flowers, which enabled sort of a new way of plant reproduction, and plants really diversified when the first flowering plants evolved. And it wasn't too long after the first flowering plants evolved that some flowering plants adapted to live in the water, and some of those adapted to actually live in salt water and became the seagrasses. So seagrasses had kind of a round trip in evolution, because the very first photosynthetic organisms lived in the water, and then some evolved into land plants, and then some of those land plants evolved to live back in the water and became the seagrasses. So seagrasses are all flowering plants. They're actually not in the grass family. Poaceae is the plant family that includes grasses. They're more closely related to lilies. So this is a terrestrial lily, and ancestors of the lilies and the seagrasses, some of them moved into the ocean and became the seagrasses. This happened during the Cretaceous era, which was the time that Tyrannosaurus rex was roaming the earth, which is why I have the dinosaur picture here. So seagrasses today are represented by about 60 different species that are found in tropical and temperate waters over most coasts of the world. There may be a few additional places where seagrasses occur that just haven't been documented or studied yet, but you can see that most parts of the world have just kind of like 2 to 5 species of seagrasses, but there are a few seagrass species hotspots in the world, like the Indo-Pacific, which is also a hotspot of coral species diversity, is a hotspot of seagrass diversity. And in Florida and the Caribbean, there are 7 species of native seagrass, plus maybe 1 or 2 invasive species of seagrass. So I'm going to go through and give a little description of each of the species of seagrass that lives in Florida and the Caribbean, starting with the most beautiful of the Caribbean seagrasses, which is turtlegrass. I think it's the most beautiful because it has bright light green, big, robust blades, and it forms thick meadows in areas with clear, high salinity water. It needs to have clear, high salinity water to survive, and you'll tend to find it more in areas with sort of oligotrophic tropical waters with clear blue waters and sandy bottoms. They call it turtlegrass because it is eaten by green sea turtles, but green sea turtles will actually eat many other types of seagrass and algae as well. They don't only eat turtlegrass. Another type of seagrass that's named after an animal that likes to eat it is manatee grass, Syringodium filiforme. So manatees don't only eat manatee grass. They'll eat many other types of aquatic plants as well. The thing about manatee grass that distinguishes it from the other seagrasses is that its blades are cylindrical rather than being flat ribbon-like blades like turtlegrass, and you can actually see a few turtlegrass blades mixed in with manatee grass blades here. But the manatee grass blades are cylindrical, so if you looked at one in cross-section, it would be a cylinder like this, like a spaghetti noodle. And you can roll it between your fingers, whereas the other ones are flat like ribbons. Manatee grass requires sort of high stable salinities to survive, and so you would find this one more in more offshore or high salinity environments, not in brackish estuaries. So a type of seagrass that is more tolerant of fluctuations in salinity would be Halodule wrightii. It can be found in high salinity waters and also in more brackish waters of estuaries. It has flat ribbon-like blades similar to turtlegrass, but the blades of Halodule are much narrower. They're only a couple millimeters wide. And the common name for Halodule wrightii is shoal grass because it tends to grow in shallow shoals. Shoals are sort of sandbars or mud bars that are shallow near the surface. So one of the things that makes seagrasses of all kinds susceptible to harm from humans is the fact that they grow in shallow waters where humans often run over them with their boats. And you can see that this seagrass bed has been scarred by the propellers of boats that have veered out of this channel and scraped up the seagrass here. So seagrass is, in some areas in particular, it's quite slow growing, and it can take a long time for these scars to heal. If there's heavy scarring, it can actually eliminate seagrass from an area, and it's one of the threats to seagrass survival worldwide. Alright, so here's another type of seagrass that's named after an animal that eats it. This one's named after a type of duck called the widgeon, so it's widgeon grass. Ruppia maritima is the scientific name for it. So widgeon grass is somewhat similar in morphology to Halodule in that it has thin, flat blades, but its blades are even narrower than those of Halodule. They're like very, very fine little slivers of grass. Something that you can tell from this image that also helps distinguish Ruppia from Halodule is that Ruppia, the widgeon grass, has a branching shoot morphology. So you'll see these little clumps of fine blades that branch off of a central stem. So widgeon grass is unique among the seagrasses in Florida in that it can grow in fresh or salt water. So it's very tolerant of a wide range of salinity levels. And you would think that it would sort of be the dominant species in estuaries because it's able to tolerate all the different salinity levels, but it seems to have some other environmental weaknesses like high light requirements and weak roots that keep it from forming the dense beds in most places that you might see with the other seagrasses. Okay, so there are 3 species of seagrass in Florida that are in this genus Halophila, and they all have short shoot morphology where the blades are more leaf-like, than have sort of oval leaves rather than long blade-like leaves. And it's the orientation of the leaves and the shape of the leaves that distinguishes the different species of Halophila from one another. So this one is called stargrass, Halophila engelmannii, because its leaves are arranged in a whorl around the top of the shoot. So there's this shoot that comes off of a runner that's underneath the sediment, and this sort of star-like cluster of oval blades. The Halophila engelmannii and the other species of Halophila usually don't form dense beds of one species, and they're more likely to be mixed in with other types of seagrass, sometimes as an understory in the canopy of shoal grass or turtle grass, although you will sometimes see a patch of this on its own. Okay, Halophila decipiens is another one of these Halophila. Instead of having a whorl of leaves, though, it has pairs of leaves. So the pairs are thought to look like paddle blades. If you take apart a kayak paddle and you sling it over your shoulders, you've got these sort of two paired blades, and that's what I think of to help me remember the paddle grass. So this seagrass is very small. The blades are really quite small, not much bigger than the tip of your finger, and this photo is zoomed way in on it. So this seagrass is pretty inconspicuous and easily overlooked, but it does provide some of the beneficial functions that all seagrasses do. This is a close relative of Halophila decipiens. It's called Halophila johnsonii, and the common name is Johnson seagrass. This is an interesting Florida species because it's only found in Florida and only found on the east coast of Florida in the southern part of the Indian River Lagoon estuary. So it has a very localized endemic distribution, and that makes it vulnerable to extinction, especially because the area in which it inhabits is heavily developed with a lot of hardened shorelines, boat traffic, pollution issues. So this is actually an endangered species, and a lot of the conservation efforts in the estuaries of east central Florida are focused on preserving the Johnson seagrass. So we should be aware that there are some seaweeds, some green seaweeds that look a lot like seagrasses and could be confused. One genus of algae in particular, Caulerpa, has green leafy structures that often look like blades or fern fronds, and they're attached to this runner that has root-like structures on it. So you might think that that was a seagrass, but if you pick up one of these blades, you'll see that it's flimsier than a seagrass blade, and it doesn't have any veins in it. And so these things lack true roots and leaves and lack vascular tissues. Also, you'd never see any flowers or anything on this because it's not a true plant. All right, so seagrass is affected by many aspects of the environment. It's a sensitive species, and because it's so responsive to many different environmental factors, it's often used as an indicator of the overall health of the environment. And so the idea is that you can go out and measure how much seagrass there is, and if there's a lot, you would say that the environment is healthy. If there's not a lot, then something might be wrong, and you'd want to look out and see if there's some sort of pollution problem or other thing that's killing the seagrass. So what are these environmental factors that affect seagrass health? We'll go through them one by one. So first environmental factor that affects seagrass health is light. Seagrasses need a lot of light. They need about 25% of surface irradiance to survive and reproduce. So that means that almost a quarter of full-strength sunlight is needed to keep most species of seagrass alive. And sunlight does not penetrate infinitely far through the water. The water itself attenuates the light, which is why you see these arrows getting smaller as they go through more water. So that sort of sets a maximum depth limit of how deep the seagrass can grow. But that's dependent on how clear the water is, because there are various things that can be dissolved or suspended in the water that increase how much light is blocked. So we'll talk about some of those. Dirt and silt. Suspended sediments is another name for this, and it can be measured as turbidity. So dirt and silt in the water, which might be stirred up from animals stirring up the bottom or from boats passing by or waves. It could also, dirt and silt could be washed in from rivers and runoff from deforested areas or parking lots. And dirt and silt suspended in the water blocks a lot of light from reaching seagrass and can kill seagrass. Another thing that blocks light is tannins, colored dissolved organic matter in the water that gives the water sort of this dark tea-stained color, and tannins block blue wavelengths of light, which the seagrasses really depend on for their photosynthesis. So if the water is dark and tannic, for natural or man-made reasons that might be harming the seagrass. And phytoplankton in the water also block light. So phytoplankton can become so abundant that they actually turn the water murky and green or brown or red or whatever color the phytoplankton cells are. And the phytoplankton are sort of blocking the same wavelengths, they're using the same wavelengths of light that the seagrass would be using, but because they're in the overlying water, the phytoplankton end up using up all the light before it can make it down to the seagrasses. I've got this arrow showing that phytoplankton are often stimulated by nutrients. So if there's excessive nutrients being introduced to the water, then there will be an excessive amount of phytoplankton growth. Nutrients themselves are invisible. They don't have any color. And some people sort of forget that nutrients themselves are just dissolved chemicals in the water. They don't block light themselves. But these nutrients like nitrate, and phosphate, and ammonia, they stimulate the growth of phytoplankton, and then the phytoplankton are solid objects in the water that do block light. Another thing that nutrients can increase, some animals like the grazing snails can actually benefit seagrass by eating the epiphytic algae and keeping the seagrass blades clean. Other animals like filter-feeding bivalves such as oysters can benefit the seagrass by reducing the clouds of phytoplankton in the water, and that also allows more light to get to the seagrass blades. Of course, some animals might directly eat the seagrass blades, which is not so good for the seagrass. So whether animals have a positive or negative or neutral effect on the seagrass depends on the situation and the type of animal. And then physical and chemical factors affect seagrass as well. So some seagrasses can only live in cold waters and they die if the water gets too hot. Others only live in warm waters and they die if the water gets too cold. Salinity has a big effect on seagrasses. Most seagrasses perform best at full strength ocean water, but some are able to tolerate brackish waters as well, and very few seagrasses, perhaps Ruppia being the one exception, can tolerate fresh or salt water almost equally well. And then water movement can affect seagrasses. If the water is too stagnant, the seagrasses might not grow so well. But if the water is too turbulent and there's big waves that are uprooting the seagrasses or burying them in sediment, that can be bad. So there's sort of a balance between you need a certain amount of water flow to deliver dissolved gases and nutrients, but if you have too much water flow, then it's going to rip you out of the ground. So something in between is best for seagrasses. So who cares about seagrasses besides me? Hopefully we'll all start to care more about seagrasses when we learn about the benefits that they provide. So seagrasses clean the water. They don't clean the water in the same way that a filter feeder does, because they obviously don't eat particles out of the water, but they clean the water in a different way that's sort of through physical and chemical mechanisms. So one of the chemical mechanisms that seagrasses have to clean the water is they can absorb nutrients from the water. So dissolved chemicals like ammonium, nitrate, phosphate, they can be taken up by seagrass blades or the epiphytic algae living on seagrasses, and that takes those nutrients out of the water and prevents harmful algal blooms like excessive phytoplankton blooms from forming. So if you've got a lot of seagrass, you're likely to have more clear water with less phytoplankton in it. Another way that seagrasses clear water is by the sort of by reducing the current speed as the water flows over the seagrasses and sort of taking some of the energy out of the waves, and that slows down the water flow as it goes over the seagrass beds and can cause suspended particles in the water to settle out of the water around the seagrass beds. So little particles that are suspended in the water, they move into the seagrass bed, but as the water slows in the seagrass bed, those little particles end up falling down in among the seagrass blades, and this seagrass can then sort of hold on to those particles and keep them from being stirred back up into the water with its roots. So the blades sort of intercept particles drifting through the water, cause them to settle out, and then sort of build up in the seagrass beds. Let's see, so that sort of covers the cleaning the water. and the first part of this sediments idea here, like their blades cause the sediments to settle down into the seagrass bed, and their roots stabilize those sediments from eroding again, and that can sort of build up the sediment layers in a seagrass bed. Seagrass also traps carbon dioxide, because when seagrass grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide from the water and incorporates it in its roots and blades. And a lot of the seagrass roots and blades, instead of decomposing quickly or drifting away, they'll actually be buried down beneath the sediments of the seagrass bed, and it ends up building up in these layers called peat. So peat means sort of like undecomposed fibrous plant material that builds up underneath the seagrass bed, and that is sort of taking the carbon dioxide out of the water and out of the atmosphere system and storing it under the seabed of the grass bed. And scientists have quantified how much carbon dioxide is sequestered in this way by seagrass beds, and it's quite a lot. Like on a per hectare basis, it's comparable with terrestrial wetlands and other environments that are really good at taking excess carbon dioxide out of the ocean atmosphere system and helping to regulate climate. Seagrasses also sort of, I mentioned that they take excess nutrients out of the water. And seagrasses enhance biodiversity. So there are a lot more types of organisms that live in a seagrass bed than in a bare mud or sand area, for some of those reasons that we talked about when we were talking about the values of structure in the environment. So the structure created by the seagrass creates more opportunities for organisms to live there. And in addition to sort of enhancing the variety of life, it enhances the productivity of life. So the seagrass itself is very productive and creates a lot of plant material, and the algae that lives on the seagrass blades is also very productive. So that leads to a lot of primary productivity, and of course you've still got the phytoplankton productivity in the overlying waters. But then all of that plant and algal material can be eaten by the animals or decomposed by the decomposers in seagrass beds, so you get a lot of secondary productivity in seagrass beds as well, and a lot of fish and invertebrates. These nurse sharks are foraging in the seagrass bed because of its high secondary productivity, the fact that there's a lot of fish and shellfish in there for them to munch on. And the final value of seagrass that I want to mention on this slide is that seagrass is beautiful. It enhances aesthetics. The Japanese even have a word for the beautiful synchronous waving of seagrass underwater. They call it monami, which means grass waves, similar to the word tsunami, which means big waves. All right. This picture here emphasizes the way that seagrass beds enhance the secondary productivity and diversity of associated life. This is a large dip net that I swept through a seagrass bed in the Banana River Lagoon near the Kennedy Space Center on the east coast of Florida. And sweeping a net through just a couple meters of seagrass bed and bringing it to the surface reveals that the seagrass bed is full of these tiny organisms, which in turn are the base of the food chain for larger predatory fish that might come through. There are some killifishes here, various species, including the rainwater killifish, which I will highlight in the pen here. So this is the rainwater killifish. This is a sheepshead minnow, which is another type of killifish. There are some grass shrimp here. There are a lot of small little snails and crustaceans like amphipods and isopods. And this whole net is basically just squirming and swarming with tons and tons of life. Whereas if I swept the same net through an adjacent unvegetated area of sand or mud bottom, there wouldn't be nearly as much life in it. So this is a real visual to emphasize how richly productive and diverse seagrass beds are. Unfortunately, despite their benefits, we're losing seagrass beds worldwide. Like a significant percentage of seagrass beds worldwide are lost every year due to man-made impacts, And probably the number one man-made impact is declining water quality. So you can see that there's polluted water coming out of a pipe here, and we mentioned earlier the sensitivity of seagrasses to things that reduce the optical clarity of the water, and things that excess nutrients that cause an overgrowth of macroalgae and phytoplankton. So you can see that's a big problem worldwide as humans degrade watersheds and develop close to the coast. Another thing that can kill seagrass is direct physical disturbance. So where there's dredging or construction along coastal areas, it can tear up the seagrass. Where there's boats running through shallow water, their propellers can tear up the seagrass. That's another type of physical disturbance. And there are sort of indirect effects of the physical disturbance as well, because of all the sediment that's stirred up can smother the seagrass, or changing water flow and salinity levels due to sort of resculpting of the coastline and water flow can cause the seagrass to die. And then climate change affects seagrass as well. So there are many temperate seagrasses that are sort of at the maximum temperature limits when they're living in mid-latitude areas, and as summers get warmer, they're sort of shrinking back into higher latitude areas where the water's still warm enough. Potentially the expansion of tropical seagrasses could make up for that, but that's a question that's kind of up in the air. Another threat to seagrass is food web alteration. So this means that changes in the animal community in coastal waters can sort of ripple through the food chain down to seagrass beds via these chain reactions, interactions of the predators with prey, and that might actually affect seagrass in harmful ways. So to understand how seagrass affects animals and animals affect seagrass, it's helpful to visualize this as a two-way interaction, where you've got these connections between seagrass and animals, where the seagrass affects the animals by providing them food, by providing a habitat and other means. And then the animals in turn affect the seagrass by eating it if they're grazers, by cleaning it. Some animals eat only the algae that grows on top of the seagrass and actually keep it clean. And some animals, they don't eat it or clean it, but they might burrow around in it as they search for prey and affect it in other ways indirectly. So there's a lot of interactions both ways between animals and seagrass, and I'll give some examples of those. So one of the main ways that seagrass affects animals is by providing a habitat for them. So it can provide a habitat for many different kinds of animals, and I just picked sort of 3 examples here. One type of habitat that it provides is a hard substrate. So particularly in an area where the bottom is sand or mud, it's hard for sessile organisms like a sea anemone to attach to something. But when you have a seagrass blade, it's actually sort of it's not permanent, but it's a relatively long-lasting hard surface for a sessile organism to attach to, and you do get many sessile organisms like anemones and barnacles and sea squirts, hydroids, rhizoans that attach to the surface of seagrass blades. This particular type of sea anemone is called a brooding sea anemone because it has asexual clone baby sea anemones that sort of bud off the side of the large central polyp of the anemone, and this one's found in Washington State. Another type of organism that loves to hang out in seagrass habitat is a variety of gastropods, so slugs and snail-like organisms. A slug, of course, is just a shell-less snail, and many times in the evolutionary tree of gastropods, which are the slugs and snails, snails, which had shells, and that's the ancestral form, lost the shells, so there are many shell-less snails that we refer to as sea slugs or nudibranchs. And this particular type is a species that lives in California, and it's well camouflaged against the blades of seagrass that are its habitat, and it finds its food in the epiphytic algae that lives on the blades, so it just spends its whole life trundling along seagrass blades and licking the algae off of the blades as its lunch. Okay, and then there are some predatory organisms that use the seagrass as a habitat as well, and some of them are very well camouflaged in the seagrass habitat. So this is the pipefish, which is a signathid fish in the family Signathidae, and it's a relative of the seahorse. They both have that sort of snout-like mouth that's good for sucking up small prey like amphipods and isopods that are hiding in the seagrass beds. And because of its long, straight body, it's really well camouflaged, and you could easily mistake it for a seagrass blade. It's strange, when I am snorkeling in seagrass beds, I rarely see pipefish, but as soon as I sweep a net through the bed, I can see that there actually were a ton of pipefish. It's just they were all invisible to the eye because of their camouflage. So seagrass beds are especially important as habitat for babies, and habitat for babies is called nursery habitat because, you know, babies live in a nursery. So baby animals of all sort, even if the adults don't live in the seagrass beds, the babies will often use the seagrass as a habitat. So the examples that I have on this slide are from temperate seagrass beds that you'd find in the northeastern United States, but there would be similar species using the beds as nurseries in tropical habitats. So we'll just go from right to left here. This is a juvenile bay scallop. So scallops are bivalves that as adults they sit on the bottom, and they're somewhat motile because they can actually clap their shells and scoot around. But as juveniles, they need to attach to something solid. They have a thread, and you can't really see it because it's underneath the shell here, but it's sort of like a sticky thread that attaches them to a solid object, and they like to attach to seagrass beds. They can attach to seaweed in a pinch, but seagrass is really their favorite thing to attach to, and that's why there's an association between this species of scallop and seagrass beds, because it likes to settle on them as juveniles. Right, so as if we lose the seagrass beds, we lose the bay scallops. Although, ironically, the scallops are actually more sensitive to pollution even than the seagrass beds are, so sometimes we lose the scallops before we lose the seagrass beds. Okay, so these fish in the next picture here are juvenile cod. So cod are this cold water continental shelf fish that lives in the North Atlantic Ocean, and there's other species in the North Pacific Ocean. But as juveniles, the little baby cod like to hang out in seagrass beds. And then this is a juvenile clawed lobster, Homerus americanus. You can tell it's a clawed lobster because it has these big pinchers. And they love to live in seagrass beds. Juvenile spiny lobsters, a tropical species, will also settle in seagrass beds when they're very small and have just come out of the plankton. So this, even though they're not closely related, there's a similarity between the cold water lobsters and the warm water spiny lobsters, in that both of their larvae like to use seagrass beds as a nursery. Okay, so while on the topic of scallops, I want to talk about this interesting trophic cascade as an example of a hypothesized connection between overfishing by humans and changes in seagrass bed ecosystems. So there was this paper published by Ransom Myers in the year 2000 in the high-profile journal Science, which correlated a decrease in the abundance of large coastal sharks like this bull shark. And the decrease in large coastal sharks was caused by humans like this fisherman here. So the idea was that large coastal sharks have been overfished, and that was supported in the data. There's definitely not as many large coastal sharks, far fewer large coastal sharks than there used to be. And the cow-nosed rays, this beautiful, graceful brown rays, seem to be quite abundant. And Myers said he thought that the abundance of cow-nosed rays was getting unnaturally large due to a lack of predators. And that these cow-nosed rays were then feeding excessively on benthic bivalves like scallops and oysters, and therefore decreasing the populations of these creatures. So the implication was that we needed to, well, the implication really should be that we need to protect the large coastal sharks. But what people did when this study came out was like, oh my God, the dang cow-nose rays are killing all of our scallops and oysters. So let's start killing the cow-nose rays. And so everyone jumped on the bandwagon. They started shooting the things with bows and arrows and trying to come up with recipes for how to cook cow-nose rays. And then another study came out that sort of questioned this whole idea and said, you know what, I've looked at the data again, and yes, large coastal sharks are being over-harvested, but he didn't think that the cow-nose ray population was actually unnaturally large. The cow-nose ray population was pretty normal, and that they were really in danger of being overfished by this sort of panicked scapegoating of the cow-nose rays, and that the main reason that the juvenile bay scallops were becoming rare was because of pollution and loss of their seagrass habitat. So really the cow-nose rays had ended up being scapegoated when it was mainly other environmental problems like water pollution and loss of seagrass beds that were really leading to the decline in the bay scallops. So keep this in mind whenever some news report comes out that something is becoming overpopulated in the environment and now we have to go out and kill it, because sometimes that's an overreaction that hasn't really considered the full environmental context. So before you go out there with your gun or your bow and arrow and start killing whatever is considered the nuisance species, remember this tale here and how sometimes we should wait till we really know what's going on before we jump to conclusions and start killing something. All right, back to the Seagrass-Animal Connections. In addition to habitat, food is one of the main ways that seagrass benefits the animals around it. So, and that happens in different ways. So there are several species of animals that directly eat seagrass blades. Even though seagrass blades, live seagrass is not the most nutritious food. It has a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, which means that it's kind of like celery or some food that you'd have to eat a lot of to get proper nutrition. High carbon to nitrogen ratio. But there are some organisms that have digestive systems that can deal with this low nutritional quality food source. So this is the green sea turtle here, which loves to eat seagrass. Manatees eat seagrass. Waterfowl eat seagrass and are some of the major seagrass grazers in temperate environments, whereas a lot of these things like the parrotfish, and this is a terminal phase stoplight parrotfish here. A lot of these things are more prevalent in tropical seagrass beds than in temperate seagrass beds, so this direct grazing on seagrass is something that happens more in the tropical seagrass beds and the temperate seagrass beds, but waterfowl like this, Canadian goose, and some invertebrates like this isopod will directly graze on seagrass in temperate zones as well. So direct grazing you'd think would be the main type of grazing, but in some seagrass beds, particularly temperate seagrass beds, there's not that much direct grazing. All right, so the other way that seagrass provides food, one of the other ways, is via seagrass detritus. So this means that the seagrass is not eaten while it's alive, that it's sort of, the seagrass grows and the decaying older blades sort of break off and are either eaten by scavengers living in the mud around the seagrass beds, gathered up by little scavengers like this hermit crab, and this is sort of a worm that would be living down in the mud and eating the bits of decaying seagrass bed. So basically, in the detritus food web, the seagrass dies first, and then the decaying seagrass and the associated microbes with the decaying seagrass are the food source. Seagrass detritus can also wash up on beaches, and then there's sort of a different set of decomposers and scavengers on the beaches that will eat it there than the ones that would eat it in the subtidal sediments. But wherever it ends up, there's going to be some microorganisms to break it down, and then scavengers, deposit feeders to eat those bits of decaying seagrass. And we think that in temperate seagrass beds in particular, This detritus food web is sort of the dominant way that the seagrass primary production enters the environment because there are fewer organisms that directly eat the live seagrass. So detritus food web, very important in seagrass beds. So another way that seagrass feeds the environment is not through the production of the seagrass itself, but through the production of the epiphytic algae that grows on the seagrass blades. So here you can see a seagrass bed that looks like it's covered in brown scum, and that brown scum is epiphytic algae growing on the seagrass blades, which is actually a more nutritious food source for many grazers than the seagrass itself because the epiphytic algae has a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio, so it's got more proteins and easily usable nutrients than the seagrass does. So, so many organisms basically ignore the seagrass itself, but they graze the epiphytes off of it. So here you can see a small snail. This is Lacuna vincta, a type of snail that lives in cool waters of the North Atlantic Ocean, and these little snails trundle along the seagrass blades and eat the seagrass. They don't eat the seagrass, they eat the algae that grows on the seagrass. This one is an Ericksonella attenuata, so it is Ericksonella attenuata. It is an isopod, so a type of crustacean. And this Ericksonella attenuata is a cryptic species, meaning that it's well camouflaged. Oops, I forgot another A there. Attenuata. It's a cryptic species, meaning that it's camouflaged and perfectly sized and shaped to sort of crawl along a seagrass blade, and it crawls along and eats the algae off the seagrass blade. Sometimes it will eat some types of seagrass in some situations, but mainly it's considered to be an epiphyte grazer that sort of indirectly benefits the seagrass by cleaning off the epiphytes. And this is a queen conch. And it is a tropical grazer that it'll eat a variety of materials, but it prefers the algal scum on the blades over the blades themselves. And it's much bigger than most of these epiphyte grazers, but it does tend to prefer to eat epiphytes. Okay, so the fact that there are these grazers that eat epiphytes is really important because epiphytes are quite a problem for blocking light, and they can also interfere with the seagrass's ability to absorb gases and nutrients that it needs from the environment. So epiphytic algae is a big threat to seagrass, and the fact that there are some animals that can remove the epiphytes is really beneficial for seagrass. So there's a name for the small epiphyte-eating organisms that come from many branches of the evolutionary tree, and that name is mesograzers. So meso means kind of small. So they're kind of small grazers, and they mostly eat algal epiphytes and not the seagrass. So here's the Lacuna vincta, there's the Gammarus mucronatus, which is a type of amphipod, Ericksonella attenuata, one of the isopods, Idatea baltica, another isopod. Palomenides pugio is called the grass shrimp. It's a decapod shrimp, more closely related to the shrimp that you might eat in shrimp cocktail. And these things all like to eat epiphytes, and experiments of various kinds have shown that when you have these things, the grass gets cleaned. When you don't have them, the grass gets dirty. Some of these crustacean mesograzers are really interesting in terms of their life cycles. They have direct development of their young, which means that instead of releasing eggs that hatch and have a planktonic larval phase, the larvae just look like miniature copies of the adults, and the larvae are actually held in a pouch on the belly of these organisms. That pouch is called a marsupium, similar to, marsupials are these early weird form of mammals that they have in Australia where the young develop in a pouch. So a similar thing has happened by convergent evolution in this group of crustaceans, where these cute little larvae. All right. So, as I said, experiments have shown how important these musicgrazers are. This is an experiment that was done by J. Emmett Duffy in 2005. J. Emmett Duffy was my PhD advisor, so I got to help with some of these experiments in the early 2000s when I was in graduate school. So this bucket on the left here is a bucket, well, we call it a mesocosm. That's sort of the scientific word for bucket. So mesocosm means a small ecosystem. So basically, to some it might look like a bucket, but to us it looks like a small simulated ecosystem. So mesocosm. And this mesocosm was planted with seagrass and ambient waters from the Chesapeake Bay. And over just a period of a couple weeks, it became totally full of gross algae, and most of the seagrass died. So this was a really bad situation, and this bucket had no mesograzers in it. So we didn't add any extra nutrients or anything to this bucket. It's just that without mesograzers, it very quickly became smothered by an excessive growth of algae, and everything died. Whereas if we added a bunch of one particular type of mesograzer to a bucket, there was lots of grazing, but it was actually a little bit too much grazing, and it really wasn't the best situation here in this bucket, because there was nothing left in that bucket except little nubbins of grass that had been overgrazed by this voracious isopod, which ate the algae and most of the grass. But it turns out that sort of the Goldilocks situation was when we had a diversity of mesograzers. So instead of just a whole bunch of one kind, we had a mix of many different types of mesograzers that were able to effectively eat all the different types of algae and did not overgraze the seagrass. So they didn't eat the seagrass, but they ate a bunch of the algae, and this was kind of the ideal situation that we were waiting for. And we were really happy about this, because it sort of emphasizes the importance of the diversity, even of these tiny organisms that most people don't even know exist. It turns out that they are really important to maintaining the health of the seagrass beds in Chesapeake Bay, and other experiments in other parts of the world have shown that diverse communities of mesograzers are really important. So then the question is, well, if mesograzers are so important and they can keep the grass clean, how do we sort of support the abundance of mesograzers and make sure that we have a lot of mesograzers and the right type of mesograzers and the diversity of mesograzers? And you know, one of the ways that we can tell grazers are really important, not just from experiments but from the wild, is there are parts of the world, like this is a picture from Long Island Sound in New York, where you see a lot of really clean eelgrass, which is a type of seagrass, and it's covered with these Lacuna vincta snails, which are doing like a super effective job of keeping the grass clean. So yet in other places you wouldn't see so many of these things, and the grass would be covered in epiphytes and dying. So if we can figure out like what's the key to fostering the abundance of these organisms, that would be really, really helpful. So an interesting ecological interaction that happens in seagrass beds is a three-way symbiosis between the seagrasses, these clams that live in the seagrasses called Lucinidae, lucinid clams, and these special bacteria that live inside the gills of the clams. And these bacteria are also found in the soil itself, but they're really like in extra large abundance inside the clams as symbiotes within the clams. So a little background on this symbiosis. One of the problems for seagrass beds is that there tends to be a buildup of this toxic chemical in the sediment called hydrogen sulfide, H2S. And that chemical builds up when sulfate is reduced to hydrogen sulfide by sulfate reducing bacteria. So in anoxic sediments, bacteria that don't have access to oxygen will use sulfate as a substitute, and that generates a buildup of hydrogen sulfide. And the hydrogen sulfide can poison the roots of the seagrass if there's too much of it. So one of the things that can kind of get rid of the hydrogen sulfide is this other type of bacteria called sulfide oxidizing bacteria. And they can sort of reverse this reaction and turn hydrogen sulfide back into sulfate. But to do that, they need oxygen, and so they need some way to get oxygen into the sediment. And so like the rate of oxidation of sulfide back to sulfate can be kind of slow because it's limited by the supply of oxygen. But one of the things that can sort of accelerate the sort of detoxification of hydrogen sulfide back to sulfate is this symbiotic relationship that happens inside these clams. So the clams sort of pump oxygen down into their body cavities, and their body cavities are full of special gills that have an abundance of these symbiotic bacteria. And the bacteria do their thing, oxidizing the hydrogen sulfide back to sulfate, and they couple that to chemosynthesis. So the bacteria are actually chemosynthetic bacteria, and the clam is able to get some energy from the organic matter produced by the chemosynthetic bacteria. So instead of filter feeding in a normal way, it just sort of farms these chemosynthetic bacteria, and that's how the clam benefits from this relationship. But the seagrass also benefits because as the clams and bacteria are reducing the hydrogen sulfide concentration in the water, the sediments are less toxic and the seagrass can grow better. And then the seagrass sort of makes its contribution by when the seagrass blades die, they settle down into the sediment and decompose in the sediment. And so all those decomposing seagrass blades actually generates a lot of hydrogen sulfide, which then is food for the bacteria, and it's a whole cycle. So the seagrass would sort of be like poisoning itself by having all this rotting organic matter around it if it weren't for the sulfide oxidizing bacteria, and particularly with the clam that kind of helps the sulfide oxidizing bacteria work faster and reduce more, reduce the concentration of hydrogen sulfide more. All right. Okay, so we're moving on to another ecosystem now. These are salt marshes. So they're different from seagrass beds because they are intertidal, and the salt marsh plants have to adapt to survive the terrestrial or semi-terrestrial conditions. And so salt marshes have to deal with harsher conditions than seagrass beds because they have to deal with all the extremes of being exposed to air. Salt marsh plants include a variety of organisms, from true grasses to other kinds of plants, but they're all united by this characteristic of being herbaceous, which means that they don't have hard woody parts. They're just like grasses or relatively short-lived, soft-bodied plants. So some of the harsh conditions that salt marshes have to deal with are hypersalinity. So when water rises during the high tide and then retreats during the low tide, the evaporation leaves really salty water and salt deposits behind, and that's tough for plants to have their roots in. Another thing that these things are exposed to is temperature extremes. So it can get really, really hot in the summertime and can scorch the plants, and it can also get really cold in the winter time, and this is supposed to be a snowflake, and that can sort of freeze the plants. You can also get these sheets of ice that cover the salt marsh, and then when the sheets of ice float up, it sort of plucks all the grass blades out, sort of like if you were waxing the hair off your legs or something like that. And so that is called ice scour, and that is a problem for salt marshes at high latitudes where it's cold and snowy and icy. So because of the harshness of the intertidal environment, there aren't that many different species that can live as plants in this habitat. And so salt marshes have low diversity. It's similar to the reason that estuaries overall have low diversity, because of these fluctuating extremes of conditions. And in some salt marshes are actually monocultures, meaning that there's only one main species of plant that lives in them. So this salt marsh is a monoculture of Sporobolus alterniflorus, the salt marsh cordgrass, which is the dominant salt marsh species on the east coast and Gulf Coast of the North American continent. So even though there are not that many species that can tolerate living in a salt marsh, the species that do live there have very high primary productivity, and because there's all this organic matter being produced by the primary producers, the secondary productivity of salt marshes is also high, meaning that there's a lot of animals that live in the salt marshes. So there are differences within a salt marsh landscape in terms of productivity and diversity. So one of the most productive parts of the salt marsh is the area right around the sort of offshore edge of the salt marsh where it sort of blends into deep water. That's where there's a lot of water currents going past with the tides, and there's a lot of exchange of nutrients and gases, and it's really good place for there to be a lot of growth of the salt marsh grass. So you'll tend to find like the tallest salt marsh grasses and the fastest growing salt marsh grasses around the edge of the salt marsh. Whereas the middle of the salt marsh is kind of not such a good place for the grass to grow, because this is where really salty water tends to be left behind, and you've got hypersaline conditions that make it tough for growth of the salt marsh in the mid-marsh area. But as you get further up, you're entering an area where it's actually not underwater very often, and so the sediments are not as waterlogged and salty, and you can start to have more productivity and diversity again. In particular, you start to have a more variety, more species that are maybe less specialized to deal with salt, and eventually, you end up with a higher diversity terrestrial community, but there's kind of a transition zone at the edge of the salt marsh where you've got a mix of these salt-adapted species, and you're starting to get more of the less salt-adapted species as well. So greatest productivity at the offshore edge, lowest productivity and diversity in the middle, and then the highest diversity, although not necessarily the highest productivity, at the inshore edge where it starts to blend with the land community. Hope that makes sense. Okay, let's talk about some of the classic salt marsh species of eastern North America. So Sporobolus alterniflorus was recently reclassified from Spartina alterniflora. So an older scientist would call this Spartina alterniflora, but this is the new species name based on genetic evidence that it should be in the genus Sporobolus. And this is the salt marsh cordgrass, super abundant in salt marshes of the East Coast and Gulf Coast. And one of the classic animals that inhabits these beds is the fiddler crab. So there are actually many species of fiddler crabs, but many are in the genus Uca. So Uca pugnax is one of the fiddler crabs. The fiddler crabs eat detritus and algae that grows on the surface of the mud here. So one of the main sources of primary production in salt marshes is not the grass itself, but is the benthic microalgae that grows on the sediment surface. And so the benthic microalgae plus the decomposing grass detritus creates sort of this rich, organic rich sediment layer that can be harvested by these little crabs that live on the mud and burrow in the mud, and these little crabs just spend all their days eating gunk off the surface of the mud. And the female crabs have two claws that are both small and good for picking stuff off the sediment, whereas the male crabs, one of their claws is giant and totally useless for feeding, but it is used as a sexual display to try to entice mates. So there's that. Okay, so another species that lives in salt marshes is pickleweed. So this is a succulent plant, meaning it's like a cactus. It stores a lot of fluid in its leaves, and they look more like blobs than leaves. So plants that store a lot of fluid in their leaves are called succulent plants. Salicornia is actually edible. You can break off these little tips and put them in a salad, and they're sort of crunchy and salty. This plant and salt marsh plants in general are what we call halophytes, meaning halo means salt, so these are plants that love salt. Let's see, what else was I going to say about the Salicornia? I don't know. I suppose I should just move on. Okay, so salt marsh ecosystem functions are similar to seagrass ecosystem functions. One is that they enhance primary and secondary production. So you've got a lot more primary and secondary production in an area where there's salt marsh than you would in just kind of a sandy or muddy intertidal area. Also, because of the biogenic structure that they provide, they have a really good habitat provisioning ecosystem function, and they can be a habitat for baby organisms. So they're a nursery area, not unlike the seagrass beds. And then there's a lot of trapping of potentially harmful materials that salt marshes do, and that's called sequestration. So salt marshes will sort of suck up and hold on to nutrients, excess carbon dioxide, and sediment, preventing the eutrophication and excess sedimentation of the coastal environment. So this is really important for keeping water quality good enough for seagrass beds and other benthic ecosystems that need good water quality. So salt marsh is really good for water quality, and also sort of a antidote to climate change to some extent, because salt marshes, as they grow and take in carbon dioxide, a lot of their organic matter is stored beneath the sediment and undecomposed, which takes that carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it underground for a long period of time. So they are really important to conserve for that reason. Another value of salt marshes to the environment and humans is that they protect shorelines. So salt marsh grasses have deep roots that stabilize the shoreline, and salt marshes can sort of advance and grow and expand, creating this buffer area between the uplands and the ocean that will sort of be partially sacrificed when a big storm comes in, but that protects the more landward structures from being eroded away. So salt marsh is really important for shoreline protection. So salt marshes have really high carbon to nitrogen ratios, even higher than seagrass beds. So not much of the salt marsh grass is eaten directly by animals. It's just not that nutritious. It's, you know, if you've ever tried to eat nothing but celery, it's no fun, and salt marshes are kind of like that. So the detrital food web is really important in salt marshes, which means that the grass debris becomes decomposed or half decomposed detritus, supporting communities of fungus and bacteria, other microbial decomposers, and then those bacteria and fungi are eaten by animals, and that's sort of how the food chain begins in a salt marsh. And one of the animals that eats these fungi and bacteria on the salt marsh blades is Literaria irorata. It's a type of snail that lives in these intertidal salt marsh habitats. It's called the salt marsh periwinkle, I believe. And scientists in the early 2000s discovered that these things seem to be intentionally farming the fungus. So what they do is they crawl up and down the blade, just kind of scarring it a little bit. So with their raspy tongues, they put wounds in the blade of salt marsh grass, and with their slime and poop, they infect the wounds with fungi. And so after a while, the fungi grows, and you can imagine little mushrooms growing on this wounded salt marsh grass, and then the snail makes another pass and eats all of the fungi that grew in its little fungi farm. So usually this is no big deal. The grass produces enough blades, and the snails mostly eat the blades that are already kind of older and decaying and already have some fungi on them. So usually it's no big deal, but if the snails get overpopulated, then they start scarifying all of the blades of the salt marsh grass, and you get a situation like this where the snails are really overly abundant and they're messing up all of the otherwise healthy grass blades, and this can actually denude the salt marsh, remove the grass, and lead to these sort of barren patches. So there are some interesting interactions between other environmental stressors and the excess abundance of snails. We think that when there's a drought and some of the grass starts to die off due to excessively salty conditions, then the snails, as they flee the dying off area, get concentrated in what we call grazing fronts. So it's sort of like a band of refugee snails fleeing the area of the salt marsh that's dying, and they sort of deplete the salt marsh in the fringe of the area that they're fleeing. So it's sort of kind of like a forest fire of fleeing snails that denudes the salt marsh, and with these positive feedbacks, it becomes a real threat that burns out areas of the salt marsh. Another factor that can lead to an excessive abundance of snails will be discussed on the next page. So here you see a bunch of snails that at high tide are clinging to the grass blades above the water line. The reason they do this is to avoid predators. So water-based predators like the blue crab love to eat these salt marsh periwinkles. And we think that one of the things that might be contributing to an excessive abundance of salt marsh periwinkles and salt marsh overgrazing by too intensive fungal farming is a lack of these blue crabs to eat the snails, because blue crabs are harvested by humans, and in areas where the fishery isn't regulated effectively, they are over-harvested, and there's not enough of them left in the environment to keep the populations of snails at bay. Okay, so that's one of the threats to salt marshes. I'm calling that threat a trophic cascade. So it's basically humans kill crabs, crabs no longer kill snails, snails become overpopulated, overpopulated snails fungal farm too intensively, which kills the salt marsh. So that's one of the things that can kill the salt marsh. But there are many other threats to salt marshes. And so some of the threats are simple direct threats. Humans have not always valued salt marshes, and so oftentimes we've just dumped fill over them so that we can build parking lots on them and things like that. Or we'll sort of dredge and drain salt marshes, sort of changing the circulation so they're no longer salty and they're replaced by other habitats. Something that we'll also do is harden shorelines. So instead of recognizing that the salt marsh itself is a good protective barrier, we'll replace the salt marsh with like a concrete wall, and that kills the salt marsh. And sometimes we'll fragment salt marsh habitats. So salt marshes along the coastline are sort of these networks of marshes connected by tidal creeks, but we'll sometimes dam those tidal creeks or build roads across them, and by interfering with the water flow through that intertidal coastal environment, we can lead to salt marsh dying in some places. Another thing that humans do that can kill salt marshes is starve them of sediment. So salt marshes don't actually eat sediment, so starved is a little bit misleading potentially, but salt marshes accrete sediment. So here's a salt marsh, and here's the sediment. So as water full of particles of sediment flows onto the salt marsh, those particles tend to settle down and contribute to this layering up of the sediment in the salt marsh. And that helps the salt marsh grow and keep up with sea level rise. So, and also help keep up with subsidence, because the soils in these areas are kind of compacting over time. So you need this delivery of more particles of sediment to the salt marsh to help kind of sustain it and allow it to build itself up. And if humans do something that cuts off the flow of sediments, like channelizing a river or no longer allowing it to flood, then we can actually be causing these sediments, the salt marshes, to no longer grow fast enough to keep up with sea level rise, and they'll disappear due to erosion and subsidence. Finally, another indirect threat to to salt marshes is climate change. So I mentioned when I was talking about the snails that drought could lead to excessively salty conditions, particularly in the middle part of the salt marsh. And although salt marshes are adapted to living in salty soil, they do have limits. And if it gets super salty, particularly if there's other stressful conditions, the salt marsh grass will die out, and then there's no more salt marsh. Another thing that happens at the low latitude edge of the salt marsh range, as the temperatures become warmer, and particularly as we no longer have really cold winters that can kill mangroves, then mangroves move into the salt marsh beds, and mangroves overgrow and shade out the salt marsh. So it's not that mangroves are a bad thing, but they can displace salt marshes, and there's sort of unique and different species that live in salt marshes that don't live in mangrove beds. So it's not necessarily a good thing that mangroves are moving into the salt marsh areas. So here's an example of the dredging of salt marshes and how that can impact them. So there's some parts of the world where salt marshes were really, really dredged. And so they cut these channels into the salt marsh to drain the salty water off the salt marsh quickly. And that actually allowed the salt marsh to turn into more of a freshwater or terrestrial grassland habitat. And that was so that you could graze cows on the salt marsh. And so, you know, this was like good for the cows, but it was bad for the salt marsh because it was no longer a salt marsh habitat. It was no longer sustaining the environment in the ways that salt marsh is supposed to, and now the salt marshes are kind of disappearing. So what they're trying to do is resculpt the channelized salt marshes so that they develop salt marsh characteristics again and can start performing the ecosystem functions of a salt marsh again, and we're moving the cows off the land. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some of the animals that live in salt marshes. These are some of the reasons that we value salt marshes are because they support so many unique animals. So there's this type of bird, actually there's a number of birds that are in this family called a rail. And there's a old-timey expression, thin as a rail, like, oh, he's thin as a rail. And so this bird doesn't look particularly thin, but that's because we're looking at it from the side. If you looked at this bird from the front, it would be really, really skinny side to side. So really skinny side to side. And why do you think it's skinny side to side? Well, it's so it can travel between grass blades. So it's tough to like run fast through a salt marsh, but if you're really skinny side to side, you can slip through the blades with predators not being able to follow you. And so these are sort of elusive camouflage birds that slip through the blades of grass in the salt marsh, and they feast on the invertebrates in the salt marsh. So they're a wonderful part of the ecosystem in salt marshes. Other birds live and feed in salt marshes as well. So this is a snowy egret, and the snowy egret likes to hang out in salt marshes and feast on the abundant fish and invertebrates in salt marshes. This is another species of heron called a bittern. You probably have not seen a bittern because they're really good at hiding. You can see this one is camouflage, so sometimes you could be looking right at a bittern, even up close, and not realize you're looking at a bird until all of a sudden, hey, that's a bird. So that's how bitterns do their thing. One of the cutest animals that lives in a salt marsh is the diamondback terrapin. So this is an interesting type of turtle that is most closely related to freshwater turtles. So if you notice that it's got these sort of clawed, webbed feet that are not like sea turtles' flippers. They're you can tell that this is more like freshwater turtles. But this turtle is tolerant of living in salt water, so unlike other freshwater turtles, it lives in salt marshes. And the diamondback terrapin, they can actually live in mangrove swamps as well, but salt marshes are sort of their main habitat. They're found in salt marshes of Maryland, which is why they're the mascot of the University of Maryland, although this mascot cartoon doesn't look all that much like the actual turtle. This turtle has a radio tracking device on it. They don't normally have this filament, but this is an artificial thing that's been epoxied to the turtle shell. And this turtle's being tracked because these poor turtles are endangered. The thing that kills them most often, in addition to habitat loss of their salt marsh habitats, is that they get stuck in crab traps. So the turtles need to breathe oxygen, and if they get stuck in a crab trap that's underwater, even if unless you pick the crab trap up like within minutes of when they get stuck, they'll drown in the trap. So that's one of the things that's inadvertently killing a lot of diamondback terrapins. Okay, so we're done with salt marshes for now, and we're going to talk about mangroves. So mangroves are sort of kind of like a sister habitat to salt marshes because they both live in the intertidal area. But mangroves are different because they are woody. They're not herbaceous plants, they're woody vegetation. So trees and shrubs are sort of, shrubs are medium-sized and trees are large-sized, woody vegetation. And any tree or shrub that can grow in salty waterlogged soil is considered a mangrove. So there's actually quite a few different species that aren't necessarily even closely related that we consider mangroves because they're woody and they have the ability to grow in salty waterlogged soil. So a forest of mangrove trees is called mangle habitat. The word kind of reminds me of the word jungle. So jungle is like a tropical forest of trees, and then mangle is an intertidal forest of trees. Mangrove habitats are restricted to tropical and subtropical regions. Why do you think that is? Well, I'll tell you because I'm narrating this PowerPoint. The reason that mangroves are restricted to sunny regions is because it takes a lot of energy to deal with living in salty waterlogged soil. It's very difficult, for example, to pump the water up to your leaves and to deal with the lack of oxygen in the sediments. And it takes a lot of energy from long, warm days and bright sunshine to sort of maintain this woody body structure in such a harsh environment. If you're just a grass or something, it's not that hard to maintain yourself in the harsh environment, and that's why the salt marshes are able to live in less optimal environments like in colder areas, whereas if you need to support this larger, more complex body of a woody plant, then you need to have that full strength tropical environment to support yourself. There's a similar thing that we observe where there's sort of a transition between trees at in more optimal habitats to as you go like up a mountain. You get to this area where the trees are kind of stunted as you get higher on the mountain, and then above that there's just a little bit of grassy plants because as you go into harsher conditions, it's harder to support this large woody vegetation, and the sort of grass or tundra is the only thing that can survive. So we see that as we go up in altitude on a mountain, and there's kind of a similar situation as we go up in latitude from tropical mangrove habitats to temperate and cold weather salt marsh habitats. All right, so where did mangroves come from? Mangroves are angiosperms, so they're flowering plants that evolved over 100 million years ago, shortly after the first flowering plants evolved anywhere. So we think from the fossil record that the first mangroves evolved maybe even a little before the first seagrasses, but it does get a bit fuzzy since we're talking about over 100 million years ago in the time of Tyrannosaurus rex. So mangroves are what we call polyphyletic, which means that they have multiple evolutionary origins. So that like a monophyletic grouping means a grouping that has a common ancestor and they all branched out from the common ancestor. So if it had been a situation where there was one ancestral tree that became a mangrove and then all other mangrove species were descended from that tree, that would be monophyletic, but that's not the actual situation. The actual situation is that there's lots of different groups of trees, and some members of many different groups of trees evolved the ability to live in salt water and therefore became mangroves. So the word mangrove doesn't mean a bunch of related species, it just means any species that happens to have evolved to live in salty waterlogged conditions. And so there are 16 different plant families that include at least one mangrove species. So that means that this evolution of the ability to live in salty waterlogged soil among woody vegetation has evolved at least 16 different times. So there are at least 16 points on the evolutionary tree where there's the evolution of the ability to live in salty waterlogged soil. Okay, so mangrove ecosystem functions are quite similar to the ecosystem functions of seagrass beds and salt marshes, which we've already discussed. So Those include sequestration of CO2 and nutrients and sediments, coastal protection against erosion. Mangroves are particularly good at protecting coastlines from erosion and storms because of their large woodiness. And habitat and primary production values of mangroves are similar to the habitat and primary production values that we've discussed for mangroves, for salt marshes and seagrass beds. So this coastal protection function of mangroves only works if you leave the mangroves there. So mangroves have sometimes been called a green barrier of protection against hurricanes and tsunamis and things like that. But in many places where the mangroves aren't properly valued, the mangroves are being cut away and the intertidal bottom is dredged out there to make these ponds where they farm fish or shrimp. Shrimp is the main one since it's a lucrative crop. And so you grow shrimp in these ponds for a while, but then the ponds tend to become really nasty and polluted, and you can't grow shrimp anymore in them because of the wastes of the previous generations of shrimp. So then you have to kind of like abandon that pond and go destroy some more mangroves to build another pond, and it ends up that you can, if this process is happening, you can really rapidly deplete all of the mangrove forests of the coast, which means you've lost all the beneficial ecosystem functions of the mangroves, and now you're really vulnerable to some hurricane coming and destroying the land and flooding the inland areas because you destroyed your natural barrier of protection. So we can this is happening in Southeast Asia and Latin America, particularly where the countries are poor and there's not like a strong environmental protection infrastructure. And so it's easy to say like, oh, you know, these third world people, they're not respecting their environment and what a shame, what a shame. But in first world countries, we're also not that great at protecting our mangroves either. This is from Cape Coral, Florida, and there was large mangrove habitats along the coast here that have then been turned into this, what we call finger fill development, where they dredge out channels and pile up the material to make the land high enough to build on, and the mangroves are destroyed in the process. Also, all the shoreline around these canals is hardened, so it's basically just a cement wall. So instead of having a plant lined shoreline where there's habitat and ecosystem functions being carried out, there's just kind of a dead concrete wall, and you're not having any nutrients being absorbed or filtration or anything like that. So this is really harmful to the environment to have this kind of coastal development that displaces mangroves. Okay, so in addition to being destroyed by humans, mangroves have some natural environmental stressors that they have to deal with. So the two big stressors are the saltiness of the soil and the fact that the soil is waterlogged and therefore low in oxygen. So we'll talk about the salt first. So high salt concentrations disrupt cellular processes. So there's osmotic stress on the cells, and the enzymes and things in the cells can't work properly if the salt concentration inside the cells is too high, or if there's too big a contrast between the salt concentration inside the cells of the plant and outside. And one of the biggest problems with this difference in salt concentrations inside and outside the plant is that the roots of the mangrove are not hyperosmotic relative to the water in the soil. So let's see, here's some soil, here's a tree trunk, and here's roots in the soil. And some roots here. All right, so in normal soil, the roots are saltier than the water in the soil. So there's like, this is what you'd see in a terrestrial tree. And so the higher salt concentration inside the roots means that water from the soil naturally flows into the roots. But for a plant that's growing in salt water, in salty soil, there's a really high concentration of salt outside the roots because the soil is full of salt. And so then the osmotic pressure would tend to have water flow from the roots into the soil, and that's the opposite of what you want to happen. It's basically like the water is getting sucked out of your roots instead of into the roots. And so the plants need some way to deal with that, otherwise they're losing water instead of sucking up water. So that is a big problem. The sort of tendency for the salty surrounding water to sort of reverse the beneficial movement of water, so water is being removed from the plant instead of just brought into the plant. Okay, and waterlogged sediment is a problem because when the sediment is waterlogged, there is no oxygen beneath the sediment. When there are air passages in the sediment and it's not waterlogged, then oxygen from the air can get down into the sediment. But when you have water filling the spaces there, the oxygen does not diffuse into the sediment as fast as oxygen is being used up in the sediment by aerobic decomposition. So the sediment has no oxygen in it, and that is a problem because roots need to get oxygen to survive. The cells in the roots need oxygen to do their cellular respiration. And if the roots don't have some way of getting oxygen, they will die. So the plants need some way to get oxygen from the air into their roots. And I'll show you some ways that mangroves have adapted to do that. Okay, so first we'll talk about some ways that mangroves deal with the excessive salt level. So one thing that they can do is have exclusion. So the mangrove roots so here's a mangrove root. They'll have special cell walls that can keep salt from getting in while allowing water in. Other mangroves, they've just sort of evolved to be okay with having a lot of salt inside them, so that's called tolerance. Other mangroves, they sort of excrete the salt through their leaves, so the salt gets in, but they have ways to get rid of the excess salt while hanging on to the water. Another thing that they can do to sort of be able to absorb water by their roots without getting too much salt is that, even though their roots are kind of inefficient because it's hard to pump water into the roots when the environment in the roots is not hyperosmotic relative to the outside environment. But the mangroves make up for that by just having a lot of roots. So if you got a lot of roots, even if your roots aren't very efficient, you can still get the water that you need. And so that results in a high root to shoot ratio. So the shoot is like the above ground portion of the mangrove tree. So and then like in a normal terrestrial plant, there would be, like some moderate 50-50 ratio of shoot to roots. So let's see, root, shoot. So the shoot's the above ground part. But in a mangrove, because the roots aren't able to be very efficient, you just have lots and lots of roots. And so you have a higher ratio of roots to shoot, and that kind of makes up for the fact that the roots are not, no single root is working very well. You just make up for that by having lots and lots of roots. Okay, so the other stress that mangroves have to deal with is waterlogged sediments. And waterlogged sediments, again, is a problem because of the lack of oxygen in waterlogged sediments. So the main way that mangroves get oxygen down into their roots is through lenticles. So they actually have pores on the tree trunk or pores on structures that stick up above the water line, and those pores connect through little air-filled snorkels down into the roots. So it's like the plant is breathing through a snorkel, and the type of snorkel tissue is called parenchyma. It's kind of like just basically air-filled pipes that help air, which is 20% oxygen, diffuse down into the root environment. So air-filled vascular tissue. If you break off one of these little nematophores are the spikes that are sticking up from the roots, you can actually, it's really spongy and you can see the air pockets in it. So nematophores are one of the sort of structures that mangroves have that is covered in lenticels and helps the oxygen diffuse into the roots. But another thing that some other species of mangroves have are these arching aerial roots, and that's kind of like the classic look of the red mangrove, where it's got these roots that are aerial above the water, and those roots are lined with the lenticels or lenticels, and that helps the oxygen diffuse down into the roots of those things. And some other mangroves have knees, kind of like you may have seen cypress trees that have the big buttress, and then they've got these knees that stick up around them. And so some mangroves, instead of having a bunch of little nematophores like the spikes on this black mangrove here, they'll have big knees like a cypress tree. All right, this slide got pretty marked up. Okay, so although mangroves are pretty amazing at dealing with the waterlogged sediments and the salt concentration, there are limits to how much stress they can handle, and they do need a lot of sunshine and warm weather to have enough energy to handle those stresses. So cold, dark weather, mangroves cannot handle that, and they're replaced by non-woody halophytes like saltmarsh grasses at higher latitudes. So this is in North Florida, and North Florida is an interesting kind of biogeographic boundary where it's currently dominated by salt marshes because of the cooler winters that they have there. But there are mangroves that are now beginning to colonize the salt marshes in North Florida as climate warms due to human effects. So just as we are seeing trees move higher on mountains as the climate warms, we are seeing mangroves move higher to higher latitudes. So who knows, in another couple decades maybe they'll already be in Georgia and stuff, but for now this is the most northerly mangrove in Florida, and this is the black mangrove. So the black mangrove, compared to the other species of mangroves that we have in Florida, is the most tolerant of cold weather, and so it's sort of like the vanguard of the advancing mangroves. It's the first one that you get as the climate is warming. Okay, so this is a little more information about the black mangrove. I'm going to talk about the three major species of mangroves that we have in Florida. There's a fourth species that some people consider a mangrove, and that's the buttonwood, but just not going to talk about that one. All right, so the three main species that we have in Florida are actually in three different families and three different genuses. So in the family Avicenniaceae, that's where the black mangrove resides, and the species name is Avicennia germinans. So the black mangrove is the one that has the most distinctive nematophores. So the nematophores, that's the word that starts pneumatophores. The pneumatophores are the obvious characteristic of the black mangrove. It also has sort of distinctive leaves and dark bark on the trunk. I think the dark bark on the trunk is why they call it the black mangroves. And the propagules of the black mangrove are distinctive. So mangroves tend not to make just regular seeds. Their seeds will actually sprout while they're on the plant and will sort of grow into a sort of large embryonic plant called a propagule. And that's one of the adaptations that mangroves have for colonizing these places that are that would be difficult for a regular seed to get established. So basically they provision their offspring with more resources from the parent to create this propagule, which has kind of a head start in life and it has more of a chance of being able to establish on a muddy shoreline. All right, and this is the white mangrove. So the white mangrove has different looking propagules. They are these sort of diamond shaped little things. And the white mangrove has different types of leaves as well. It's in the family Combiataceae. The genus is Laguncularia, species is Racemosa. The white mangrove has distinctive looking leaves. The leaves at the base of the leaf is red, and that's called a petiole. And there's two little nubbins at the base of the leaf that are called nectaries. That's also distinctive. And the leaf at the tip, it tends to have an indentation at the tip. So that's distinctive as well. And if you look at the leaf in the light, you can see that there's these little black spots in the leaf, which are little holes in the leaf where mites live. So if you hold the leaf up to the light, you'll see this in the white mangrove leaf, and you would not see that in the black or red mangrove leaves. Okay, so the red mangrove is the most distinctive of the mangroves in Florida because it's the only one that has the prop roots. So it's got these conspicuous aerial roots that the black and white mangroves don't have. Oh, I should mention the white mangrove will sometimes have nematophores, like the black mangrove, but the black mangrove is the one that has the most nematophores. Anyways, red mangrove, it doesn't have nematophores. It's got prop roots, these big arching prop roots. It has big dark green waxy looking leaves, and it has these big propagules. So these things that look kind of like green beans are the young plants. So after the mother mangrove flowers, you see this protruding growing propagule, which is the baby mangrove that then drops off the tree, floats through the water, and hopefully roots somewhere. So red mangroves are in the family Rhizopherae, the genus Rhizophora, species Mangle. So there are some other mangrove species in other parts of the world that are in this same family. So this is a family that actually has multiple species within one family. Okay, so in other parts of the world, there are some strange groups of trees that have become mangroves. And so one of these strange mangrove groups is the palm genus Nippa. So this palm actually lives in estuarine waters, so it's a mangrove. So mangroves have different zones to the mangrove swamp, and swamp is a word that is used for a wetland with woody vegetation. So since mangroves are woody vegetation, we would say a mangrove swamp rather than a mangrove marsh. So swamp equals woody, marsh equals herbaceous, so like grasses and soft plants. All right, so like a salt marsh, the fringing area of the mangrove swamp, where it's up against the river or the tidal creek, tends to be the most productive area because that's where you have the most exchange of gases and nutrients that help foster the productivity of the mangrove. Even though that you might have full strength seawater at the edge of the mangrove swamp here, it won't usually become hypersaline because there is the circulation. So at least salinity is not going to get higher than this. Whereas if you're in the middle of the mangrove swamp, you can often have hypersalinity developing there, where it gets even saltier than 35 parts per thousand, and that tends to mean the soils are really, really salty, and you have these stunted mangroves because they're working so hard to deal with the salty waterlogged soils that they're not able to get much water into their tissues. And you can have these mangroves that are really dinky like this, but they might be 80 years old, and we know that because when we core these mangroves and count their rings, there's like 80 rings inside the mangrove. So we know that the ones in this sort of middle area of the mangrove swamp that we call the basin are old and stunted because of the stressful conditions there. As we move further up in the intertidal zone, the mangroves are not inundated as much, and so there's more of like a freshwater influence in the soil, and they're less sort of salty and waterlogged, and so more species are able to survive, and you start to get not only the species that we would call mangroves, but some other somewhat salt-tolerant species that we call mangrove associates, and you end up having higher plant diversity as you get higher up in the mangrove swamp, where it's beginning to blend into like a terrestrial non-mangrove habitat. Okay, so there's a lot of different kinds of animals that live in mangrove swamps, and we can sort of divide them into animals that their closest relatives are terrestrial animals that live in regular forests, and you can divide them also into marine animals, so animals that normally live in the ocean environment. And the weird thing about mangroves is that they're sort of a forest at the same time as they are a marine intertidal environment, because even compared to salt marshes, they have so much above water area. So the tree canopy is inhabited by animals that are similar to what would live in the tree canopy of a regular jungle, even though below the waterline you've got organisms that you might find in a seagrass bed or a reef. So it's really a cool double ecosystem with what's below and above the waterline. So anyways, above the waterline you have a lot of these creatures of terrestrial origin, so birds like this mangrove cuckoo, bees, bugs, raccoons, snakes, mosquitoes, lots of mosquitoes. I personally would avoid working in mangroves if you have another choice of a marine ecosystem to study. People that work in mangroves do it because they have a true love for mangroves and recognize the importance of mangroves, because mangroves are one of the most challenging environments to work in. So if you're a true hardcore marine biologist who's really committed to saving the environment, then you should work in mangroves. But if you're kind of wimpy, don't do it. All right, so one of the types of bugs that lives specifically in mangrove forests is Cocotripes rhizophorae. It's a type of beetle that specializes in its larvae bore into the inside of a red mangrove propagule. So this kills the propagule, like this propagule can no longer sprout into a mangrove tree. So these beetles don't kill the adult mangrove, but if there's too many of them, they can keep the propagules from being viable, and that means that the next generation of mangrove trees might be limited if there's too many of these beetles living inside the propagules. So there are many kinds of birds that can hang out in mangrove swamps. One of the types that we see here in Southwest Florida is the white ibis, and we also see the glossy ibis in South Florida. We do not see the scarlet ibis in South Florida unless they're just got blown in from a hurricane or something, but the scarlet ibis live further south in the Caribbean and in South America. And these are birds that eat invertebrates and can forage effectively in mangrove swamps as well as in freshwater habitats. The white ibis is the mascot of the University of Miami, if that's just a little piece of trivia. All right, so the scarlet ibis is the most beautiful of the ibises because it's red, and there's an interesting ecological story surrounding the scarlet ibis. So one of the places that they live is on the island of Trinidad in the southern Caribbean near the coast of Venezuela. So there historically have been resident and migratory populations. This is short for populations in Trinidad. That means that there's some of the scarlet ibises stay there year-round, which would be considered the resident populations, and others are only there for part of the year, and then they move back to mainland South America for the rest of the year. So those would be the migratory populations. So scarlet ibises, when they're adults, they can eat salty food like shrimps and fish from a mangrove swamp. But baby scarlet ibis need to have food that's lower in salt content. So baby scarlet ibis need food that comes from freshwater wetlands. They cannot eat food from mangroves. So in Trinidad historically, that was fine because there were mangroves where the adult scarlet ibis could feed and where all the scarlet ibis would go when it was not the breeding season. But during the breeding season, the scarlet ibis would have to go to the freshwater swamps in Trinidad to feed. Unfortunately, due to excessive development in Trinidad, those freshwater swamps were mostly destroyed. So there's no place for the scarlet ibis in Trinidad to find food for their babies, and so they could no longer breed and be resident in Trinidad. So basically all of the scarlet ibis in Trinidad had to start being migratory. They had to start going to mainland South America to breed. So in mainland South America, there were plenty of freshwater habitats, but the freshwater habitats in mainland South America were polluted with mercury from gold mining in the hills and the watersheds above those wetlands. So even though the food in those freshwater marshes was fresh enough for the baby scarlet ibis, they were getting a high load of mercury contamination. And interestingly, the scarlet ibis that were contaminated with mercury, when they flew back to Trinidad for the non-breeding season and shed their plumage, their plumage was so full of mercury that it was actually polluting the mangrove swamps in Trinidad with mercury that ultimately came from South America. So it's kind of like a weird story of how um, two different environmental impacts in different parts of the world. First, the destruction of swamps in Trinidad, and second, the polluting gold mining in Venezuela ended up with this sort of double impact on the mangrove swamps and scarlet ibis populations in Trinidad. All right, so continuing with the organisms in mangrove swamps whose closest relatives are terrestrial or freshwater organisms, we've got some crocodilians, like crocodiles tend to like salt water. So the American crocodile in the Caribbean and South America lives in saltwater mangrove habitats a lot, and in the Indo-Pacific, Crocodylus porosus, the so-called saltwater crocodile, which is the largest crocodilian alive in the world today and the most infamous man-eater, loves to live in mangrove swamps. There are raccoons of various kinds that live in salt marshes. So the common raccoon lives in salt marshes and mangroves when it can. But in South America, there's a relative of the common raccoon called the crab-eating raccoon that is really a specialist in living in mangrove swamps. And as the name implies, cancrovorous, it means crab eater. It likes to eat crabs. And so another thing that has crab eater in the name is the crab-eating frog. So it's a type of frog that lives in Southeast Asia and lives in mangrove swamps in the Indo-Pacific. And unlike most species of amphibian that have very low tolerance of salt, this one is able to tolerate somewhat brackish water. So it can't live in pure salt water. It still prefers mostly fresh water, but it is rare in its ability to tolerate at least a little bit of brackishness in the water, and in that environment it eats crabs, so it's called the crab-eating frog. Another cool mangrove critter, now a critter whose closest relatives are ocean fishes, is this specialized type of goby, the mudskipper. So mudskippers live in the Indo-Pacific, and they can spend a lot of time exposed on the mud in the intertidal zone. And what they do is they have burrows in the mud that they'll retreat into when they need to get some water. And keep from drying out. So they are able to take shelter from extreme drying out. But the mudskippers, as they occupy the muddy floor of the mangrove swamps, have a lot of fights over territory, especially because the male mudskippers will sort of maintain a territory and defend the right to mate with the females in that territory. So if you are ever observing mudskippers in Southeast Asia, you might see these interesting territorial displays where the male mudskippers will erect their dorsal fin to intimidate the other males, and they'll gape their mouths open to show how fierce they are. These fish aren't singing, they're threatening each other. And then if the threats don't intimidate the potential competitor away, they'll actually have a fight. Some of the animals that live in mangrove swamps that have marine origins are very important to the functioning of the mangrove environment. And mangrove tree crabs, Aratus pisoni, are some of the really important, influential marine organisms in mangrove swamps, because these crabs actually chew up with their pinchers and eat the mangrove leaves, and in the process they drop a lot of mangrove leaf litter to the bottom, which can be decomposed and eaten by other organisms. So they're kind of the shredders of the mangroves that help make the mangrove material available to other organisms. There are snails that will eat algae and detritus on the mud in the mangrove swamps, but when they become larger, they will eat mangrove leaf litter as well, and that's an ontogenetic diet shift. So when they're small, they're eating the little microbial and detritus things in the mud, and when they're large, they're able to process the leaf litter a little bit better. So yeah, these crabs, there's a typo here. The genus used to be Cesarma, and now it's Aratus. The family is Cesarmidae, but the particular genus of crabs is actually Aratus pisoni. So these mangrove tree crabs, they're one of the few invertebrates that can eat mangrove leaves directly, and we don't even quite understand how they're able to do it because the mangroves are so poorly nutritious. I've mentioned several times in this lecture that, oh yeah, seagrasses and saltmarsh grass, it's like eating celery because it has such a high carbon to nitrogen ratio, but that's nothing compared to the mangroves, which have a really, really high carbon to nitrogen ratio and so much structural carbohydrates. They're hard for most organisms to eat. But since these crabs do shred and eat the mangrove leaves and turn them into more easily decomposed and eaten leaf litter, they're considered ecosystem engineers. So that means I'm about to have to explain what ecosystem engineers are. So ecosystem engineers are organisms that modify their environment in ways that end up affecting other organisms. So the classic example of an ecosystem engineer is the beaver. I'm try writing in cursive and see if it's faster. So the beaver is a large terrestrial semi-aquatic rodent that lives in temperate North America. I think maybe there's beavers in Europe too. I'm not a beaver expert. Anyways, the beaver, it's got this cool flat tail that it uses to swim, and it can also slap against the surface to make a loud noise. And beaver eats vegetation and particularly likes to chew up sticks, and it can even cut down trees, and it arranges them into a beaver dam that it can block off a stream with, and so it creates a lake. So where it would have been a fast-flowing stream environment which would have supported different kinds of life, now that beaver has created a lake, and there could be different types of fish and plants and invertebrates in the lake than in the stream. So it's really modified its environment via its engineering of this dam. All right, so here's a technical definition of ecosystem engineers and biogenic structure, because a lot of times the ecosystem engineers modify their environment by creating structure. Okay, so the general definition: an ecosystem engineer is an organism that modifies, creates, or destroys habitat, or that directly or indirectly modulates the availability of resources to other species. So it's kind of a broad definition, and in fact, if you stretch, you can almost every organism is an ecosystem engineer to some extent. It's just some have more obvious and strong effects on their environment than other organisms. So there's two types of ecosystem engineering: allogenic and autogenic. So allo means outside or different from oneself, and auto means via the self. So allogenic ecosystem engineers mechanically alter materials in the environment, thereby changing environmental structures or conditions. So that would be like the beaver that engineers with wood, or the gopher tortoise, which is a terrestrial tortoise that digs these burrows and modifies the environment that way. The stingray, which creates these pits in the sediment when it feeds, and those pits alter the sea bottom environment for other organisms. And then filter feeding organisms, which make the water more clear as they remove particles from the water, and that modifies the environment. And then there's autogenic ecosystem engineers. So autogenic ecosystem engineers, they themselves are the environmental structures, and simply by existing and growing, they're sort of creating a different environment. So a tree, because it creates shade and blocks wind and things like that, just by being there, it's doing ecosystem engineering. Same with a kelp bed or a coral in a coral reef. And some organisms can be both allogenic and autogenic engineers. Like the coral, they're making a structure that's modifying the environment, but they're also filter feeding and clarifying the water, which is modifying the environment in an allogenic way. So sometimes one organism might have multiple modes of ecosystem engineering. So the example of one of those organisms that has multiple modes of ecosystem engineering is the oyster. Actually, there's many different types of oysters, but lots of them do these things. So the mode of allogenic ecosystem engineering is filter feeding. So these two tanks of water, before this picture was taken, they were both murky like this. And this murkiness is due to a lot of phytoplankton in the water. But there were oysters in one of the tanks, and the oysters, in a relatively short period of time, they filtered the phytoplankton out of the water, increasing water clarity, which increases light penetration, which affects other species. So basically, these oysters are modulating the availability of light. They're modulating the amount of light in the environment by removing the phytoplankton. So that means that they are allogenic ecosystem engineers because they're changing the amount of this thing in the environment. And then the phytoplankton themselves, oddly enough, are also ecosystem engineers, but they would be autogenic ecosystem engineers because it's the phytoplankton bodies themselves, just by being there, that are blocking the light from getting into this environment. So even the phytoplankton themselves are an ecosystem engineer because they're reducing the availability of life for whatever might be trying to grow on the bottom. Okay, so autogenic ecosystem engineers. Oysters are autogenic ecosystem engineers because they grow one on top of each other and create this, this structure in the environment that creates habitat for other organisms, and also that kind of changes the way the currents flow through the water and creates just a lot of changes in the environment that you wouldn't have if there were no oysters there. Okay, so some examples of ecosystem engineering by some of the organisms that we have talked about in this lecture, marshes, seagrass, and mangroves, would be like the way they sequester sediment. So where you've got the plant, and because the plant intercepts the particles of sediment, you end up with this buildup of sediments, and so you're sort of building up the seabed where you have these things, and that's an important type of ecosystem engineering. Bioturbation by infaunable invertebrates and megagrazers. So if you've got like a stingray, oh boy, it's not my best stingray. There's a stinger, here's the eyeballs. You can't see the mouth because it's underneath. Make it a little more fierce. So the stingray, when it feeds, it creates these pits in the sediment, and then the pits can sort of collect seaweed or whatever. Also, it stirs up big clouds of dirt when it feeds, and that sort of modifies the light environment. So that's modifying the environment there. So this would be bioturbation. Reef building, so oysters, worm tubes, and corals. So here's corals that are mounding on top of each other, and over time, they're building this environment. So that's reef building, super obvious type of ecosystem engineering. Okay, so I think this is the last slide, and this is about fouling communities. So we've been talking about all these interesting structural habitats, the corals, the seagrasses, mangroves, salt marshes, and there's this kind of like overlooked group of biogenic structure-forming organisms that has been considered in kind of a negative light in the past. That's why they're called fouling communities. Like, fouling means messing something up. So fouling communities are so named because, back in the days of like ancient sailing ships and stuff, I'm drawing a sailing ship here, the bottoms of the boat hulls, when the ships were in the water, here's the keel of the ship, they would get, so here's some waves, they would get crusted over by seaweed and barnacles and things like that, to the point where, I forgot the rudder of the ship, to the point where it would really be slowing the boat down, and it would take like twice as long to deliver its cargo from Europe to North America or whatever route it was taking. So the sailors viewed this in a negative light, and they considered those organisms to be fouling the bottom of the ship. So that's why they call these things fouling organisms. So we considered these in a negative light for a long period of time. Even though these communities are actually really diverse, interesting communities. You've got colonial sea squirts of various kinds on here. If it's in an area with light, you get the various kinds of seaweed. You get bryozoans, sponges, barnacles. It's really like a diverse group of life, and they carry out important functions like filter feeding and things like that. So they're adding secondary structure to the environment, and they're doing lots of cool things. and there's a lot of diversity and interesting competitive interactions going on there. And so even though they have this bad name, fowling communities, they're actually really scientifically pretty interesting.